Welcome to the role of trauma-informed care and incident investigation and prevention planning. We decided to put together a video to help investigators to be able to really consider trauma-informed perspectives when they're out there doing investigations. It's clearly a critical need. It's one that we think is important, and investigators need to have access to some of this kind of information. I just wanted to, before we get into the video, tell you how much we appreciate the work that the investigators do out there. It's a challenging job. It's one that is ever so meaningful, though. You don't realize how important the work that you do impacts the lives of the people that we support in Ohio. And the whole point of doing this particular training was to give you extra tools, better information to be able to do your jobs and do it well. We're so thankful to have you and the work that you do out there, and I think this is only going to build your skill set and tools to be able to effectively and positively impact change in Ohio. Ohio has a robust system for reporting and investigating incidents of abuse involving individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities. Investigative agents work at the local level with police departments, children's services boards, and providers of service to make sure that allegations of abuse are reported, investigated, and there are prevention plans developed to assist families in trying to move forward regarding these abuse cases. Research has been done by Dr. Nora Baladarian through the Disability and Abuse Project out of California. And in this particular research study, there was over 7,000 individuals and families that were interviewed. And of those 7,000 families and individuals that were interviewed, 70% of them indicated that there had been some kind of abuse within their life. Of those 70%, 90% said that the abuse happened on multiple occasions, and there were many, many of those 90% who said it happened more than they could count. I share this information with you because I think it's really important that we know the prevalence of what we're talking about and the trauma that's inflicted upon individuals that have intellectual and developmental disabilities, because that's really the problem that we're trying to address and the reason we're trying to come together and provide this kind of training and support. So what's nice about Ohio's system, we've got a way to identify specific data. In Ohio, there were over 1,500 allegations that were reported in calendar year 16. Of those almost 1,500 allegations, about 500 of them were substantiated, giving us a substantiation rate of about 30%. Again, the point of talking about the national statistics and Ohio statistics is to let people know this is happening, and it's happening more than we probably think. The other part that I think is worthy of mentioning is abuse is a difficult thing to report. So there's going to be multiple times when it doesn't get reported. It happens that way in the general population. It's going to happen that way with individuals that we support. So the nice thing that's going on in Ohio now is IAs, police officers, children's service workers are all working together collaboratively to investigate these cases. And something that's really unique is through the Attorney General's office and the Ohio Peace Officers Training Academy, there has been a curriculum developed called Trauma-Informed Policing. And in calendar year 17, over 30,000 police officers in Ohio are going to receive training on trauma-informed policing, and that's tremendous. That's absolutely tremendous. It's a 6-hour course that's going to give information to officers about special populations throughout Ohio, folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, those that might have PTSD, folks that experience mental illness. It's a really, really comprehensive curriculum to prepare officers and give them the tools they need when they arrive on the scene of a challenging situation to be able to deal with it in a very trauma-informed way. So it's very exciting. And I think Ohio has a lot to be thankful for in terms of this commitment that's been made to provide this kind of training to those that need it the most. Trauma is an event that is experienced by individuals as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and which has lasting adverse effects. So the way to try to remember that is it's an event that the person experiences in a really challenging way, either physically or emotionally harmful, and it's an outcome or an effect based on that experience. So there's an event, there's an experience, and there's an effect. The population supported in Ohio is very, very vulnerable, and clearly the majority of the victims have experienced some kind of trauma. So there's no question that understanding trauma, understanding the elements of trauma, and implementing that in the investigative practice is absolutely critical. And it's one of the main reasons that we're conducting this training video, is to make sure people have the skills and abilities to come into a situation to interview individuals and to do it in a way where we don't re-traumatize victims. Experts say that physical and emotional abuse is certainly traumatic. It's an event in a person's life that they experience, usually in a very negative way, that has a lasting adverse effect. And there's no question that abuse impacts a person's ability to feel safe. That's one of the key elements of trauma, as well as people don't feel safe. And when you don't feel safe, that can have all kinds of challenging behavioral issues for folks. People act differently when they don't feel safe. And sometimes in our field, we don't always understand that someone's behavioral interaction may be the result of experiencing trauma. I think sometimes we think, people might be aggressive or people might be self-injurious, and we think that's just who they are. We don't always realize that that can be the result of experiencing a traumatic effect or a traumatic issue within the person's life. So I think it's pretty important that we as a field address those kind of challenging behaviors, not necessarily as negative behaviors, but as a way of a person's deals with traumatic events. The 4Rs are steps that are taken to build a trauma-informed program or organization or process. And basically, they're very straightforward. The first R stands for realizes. That you realize the widespread impact of trauma on individuals and families across the state of Ohio. You know, by virtue of us bringing this video to you and talking to you about the history and how involved trauma is, you realize that it's something that we need to address. Second is to recognize the signs and symptoms, and I think we're doing a better job across the state. As I mentioned, collaborative efforts with law enforcement, with investigative agents, with providers, recognizing that trauma, looking into the situations and trying to make sure that we provide assistance. Then you got to respond, and that's again what's really been nice about some of these investigations and the collaborative efforts is that we are responding. Those kind of things happen. We realize that we need to take action, and in Ohio we're doing that. We've got an obligation to protect people, and we take that obligation very, very seriously. And then the last R stands for resists, and that's to resist re-traumatizing folks. People that have gone through abuse or neglect don't need to be re-traumatized as we as professionals come in to try to help. So having this kind of training where people can look at their role and to make sure that they're able to help protect people, provide investigative techniques that are not going to re-traumatize folks is critical. Avoiding re-traumatization isn't something that's easy, and obviously to avoid it, you've got to have an understanding of what it is. So I'm thinking that we really got to do a good job of making sure that investigators have a good understanding of trauma and can look at individuals through a trauma-informed lens. And that's something that I think is absolutely critical. Let me just give you an example. Sometimes examples I think are more helpful than talking the jargon. So let's say I'm a person that's physically aggressive, and someone might even say that I just arbitrarily pick people to be aggressive towards with really no rhyme or reason. To someone who's not trauma-informed, they may look at me and think of me as just an aggressive individual. Someone who's been trauma-informed would have a really good understanding and would say, you know what, Scott probably is aggressive because he acts that way because he's been through trauma in his life, and this is the way that his brain helps to protect his body, to make sure that the trauma is dealt with. So there's two different ways of looking at this. One group says, what's wrong with you? Why are you so aggressive? That's the non-trauma informed person. The trauma-informed person says, what's happened to you and how can I support you in regards to this? And to me, that makes all the difference in the world. It changes the way that we look at how people interact with us. It changes the way with which we should interact with folks. And to me, it kind of really is a game changer in building relationships and trying to move forward related to trauma. If you aren't thoughtfully interviewing folks through trauma-informed lenses, you could certainly traumatize or even trigger a response. So it's really important to keep in mind the basic premises of trauma-informed care. There's several things to consider when you're conducting an interview with someone who's been through a traumatic experience. The first one is, and this is critical, always use a calm approach. Never be confrontational. The minute you become confrontational is the minute that the individual feels like power and authority is taken away from them, and that's what trauma is all about. When people don't feel safe, when people don't feel comfortable and confident, then the traumatic events tend to take over for them. So really important to be calm. Talk to the person, be very calm. I want to talk about rapport building. And you don't hear that a lot in interviewing, but to me rapport building is critical, particularly for the population that we support. When you come in, and I know investigators are a funny sort sometimes, they want to get information, they want to get what they need, and they want to move on. But I'll tell you that it's absolutely critical when interviewing an individual who's been through a traumatic situation to make sure that you build that rapport. And you can do that in a lot of ways. You can come in and sit down and talk about the Buckeyes. You can come in and talk about a person's family. You can talk about things that you might have mutual interest in. Before you get to the discussion of those rough things to talk about, rapport building is critical, particularly in a trauma-informed way. So you want to make sure you're checking in with that person during the interview. You want to make sure you let them know that you're there to help, always reinforcing for them why you're there so they're not nervous. They're going to be nervous anyway. Whenever you're interviewed, you're going to be nervous. Do your very level best to build that rapport, to start that relationship, to help that person feel safe, even though it might only be for a short time while you're interviewing them about a situation. So I want to talk about where to do the interview. You always want to interview in a comfortable place, someplace where the individual feels very comfortable, because again, as I mentioned, anytime you're interviewed, it's going to be nerve-wracking. So do it in a place where they feel comfortable. But try to do your research a little bit ahead of time. You don't want to interview somebody in a bedroom where an alleged incident happened if you can keep from it. So do a little legwork up front. Allow that person to kind of dictate where they feel most comfortable and make sure that that interview takes place there. Be aware of personal space issues. Research indicates that many people who have been through traumatic experiences have real difficult times with personal space. You know, they've been fearful a lot of their life, and the very most innocent pat on the shoulder as support could potentially cause someone to be re-triggered based on a situation that happened. So a lot of really good people do things that all of a sudden they wonder, why did someone try to hit them? Well, they didn't realize that there's a real personal space issue for someone who might have been through a traumatic situation. So be careful and certainly be aware of those personal space issues as well. When you're talking to folks, there's going to be times during the interview when you have to try to get information. That time when you're talking about the nuts and bolts of what really happened, how the abuse occurred, how the sexual abuse might have taken place, those are the critical times, absolute critical times when someone could be re-triggered or be re-traumatized during an interview. So use your trauma-informed lens very clearly when you're asking those kind of questions. And let me just give you another example of questions I've heard from good people that were trying to do the right thing. Listen to these questions, tell me what you think. Why didn't you call for help when your father was hitting you? Why'd you wait 3 days to tell somebody what happened? What do these kind of questions say to a victim when we're talking with them? It says that we're kind of blaming you. Why didn't you? Why didn't you? Those kind of questions got to be avoided at all costs. You got to really focus on the positive side of the situation. And I guess it's something, the very same question could be asked in this way. Were you able to tell someone? Were you able to get a hold of somebody to let them know what happened? That's a whole different connotation than why didn't you, shouldn't you have, all those kind of things that talk about victim blaming. And when you're interviewing someone, something that's I think is really key is to talk about communication during the interview. Individuals that we support communicate in a number of ways. Some people use communication boards. Some people use sign language. Some people want to have a favored family member or support staff with them to kind of help get their point across because maybe they can't vocalize it the way that they would like to. Make sure you do your homework and have the person as comfortable as they can be so that they can communicate well with you during the interview. You don't want to cause stress by not allowing them to be able to communicate in a way that makes the most sense. You also want to avoid making false promises during interviews. This is a really tough thing to do for people and investigators always want to help. They want to be there, they want to support. But you got to be really cautious about not making false promises. Sometimes if you come into a situation and you say, hey, I know something bad's happened to you, I'm here now, all's going to be better, there's not going to be anything more that's happening. Unfortunately, most of the time you can't assure that. So we want you to come in there, we want you to be supportive, but realize you got to be sensitive to a person's fears. They're going to be scared. They've gone through a traumatic situation, they've been abused. Your 20 to 30 minute interaction, as good as you're going to make it, is not going to erase a lifetime of potential situations where people have been through abuse and traumatized over their life. So you can certainly remain sensitive to the person's fears. You can be supportive. You can be positive. You can be sensitive. You can be calm. I'd expect that you're flexible, that proactively talk to persons about what's going to happen next. Be very patient. Be clear. and avoid any unnecessary touch if you're not sure about personal space issues. And you can also show confidence in your ability to support this person, and that's the expectation. But making false promises, making promises that you can't deliver on, if something else were to happen, that's worse than if you hadn't said it to begin with. So really important to be supportive and to be there, but not to go overboard. And you got to really be careful never to take negative reaction or negative responses personally. And sometimes that's hard to do. When you come into a situation and you're there, and you are there to help, and you're excited about what you're going to be able to do to help, and someone maybe isn't receiving you as openly as you had hoped, you can't take it personally. Because what have we said earlier? The way that individuals react to traumatic events and to re-triggers of traumatic events can be very different. And the person could lash out. And it's not that they're lashing out at you, it's their body's way, their brain's way of protecting their body because they've been through this kind of historical trauma and abuse. So very important to keep that in mind. Investigators work hard to thoroughly investigate incidents, identifying causes and contributing factors to prevent future incidents. Does trauma play a role in the recommendations made by an investigator? Definitely. There's no question that trauma should play a role in the recommendations and the follow-up and the outcome from an investigation of abuse. Obviously, you'll hear a lot in the trauma-informed world about talking about building resiliency. And any recommendation that comes out of an investigation should always be guided towards trying to build resiliency. And that sometimes is hard for people to understand. What does build resiliency mean? It's kind of a big global discussion. And building resiliency can be different for different people, but I think the ultimate outcome is we have professionals within the DD field that do a terrific job of identifying trauma and coming up with ways to provide supports. So I think it's very important to remember that an outcome of the investigation should guide towards building resiliency and helping that person to become more whole after being through a traumatic experience. Let's talk about building resiliency in greater detail. Building resiliency can be different for each person. However, there are some key components that come into play for everyone who has been through traumatic events and are working towards building resiliency. And some of the research and some of the information I reviewed that I really liked was empower, voice, and choice. And I want to talk about those three terms just quickly here because I think it's really important. Empowering the person. I think anybody who's gone through an abusive situation has had power and control taken away from them. So a key principle to helping build resiliency for that person is to bring power and control back into that person's life. A person who has power and control over their life feels better about themselves, has confidence in what they do, and makes life happen in a much better way than someone who feels like they're powerless, feels like they can't do things for themselves. So it's really, really important that our investigation outcomes focus on how we can empower people to become more in control of their life. I want to talk about voice as well. So people who don't have a voice tend to come from abusive situations. Their voice is taken away by the abuser. So some of the outcomes that are necessary through these kind of investigations is to give that person their voice back. Give them the ability to speak for themselves. Give that person the ability to make decisions for themselves. And when they can do that, as power and control and authority come back in somebody's life, they begin to live. And they begin to live more completely. So it's really important that we empower people, that we give people that voice, and that we do the next thing, and that is choice. One thing that I know in terms of working in the field of developmental disabilities for a long time is that sometimes we don't always give people the benefit of the doubt when it comes to making choices in their lives. Everybody makes choices, some good, some bad, some indifferent, but you have the ability to make those choices. And what's really frustrating is for folks that have gone through these traumatic events, they haven't been able to make choices. Choices have been made for them. They haven't had the power to make their own decisions, and as a result, they start to live in that world, in that arena, not really understanding how many opportunities are out there, how many choices can be made. So I guess it's critical from my perspective in terms of outcomes and prevention to try to make sure that we empower, that we give voice, and most importantly that we allow people to make choices. People are going to make bad choices. You've made bad choices, I've made bad choices. But you're responsible for the choices that you make, and by virtue of having that power and authority to make the choice, you become more confident in your life, and you become more and more able to build resiliency and to be that person that you were before those things were taken away from someone. So I think it's really important to remember: empower, voice, and choice. As Ohio becomes more trauma informed, we have a better understanding of why people present themselves in the manner that they do. Taking trauma into consideration during an investigation allows us to be more mindful of our own practices by having an understanding of the people that we're supporting. And so basically I see it as twofold. We've got to figure out how we don't re-traumatize someone, but before we can do that, we've got to understand and have good knowledge of how trauma impacts people. And the best investigator is going to be the person that can pull those two things together, feel really good about that, conduct an investigation that makes sense, that doesn't re-traumatize, and at the end of the day comes up with outcomes and prevention that's going to help that person move forward. So I think that the knowledge that we have about trauma-informed care in Ohio, and it's exploding. You guys know that. It's blowing up. And it's not just within the field of intellectual disabilities. It's within all health and human services industries in the state. And it's really, really impacting and changing the way that we provide service. And I can't tell you enough, if you haven't had the opportunity to get good training on trauma-informed care, I'm going to suggest that you do that. This is kind of an offshoot for investigators. There's so much good training out there regarding trauma-informed care, and everybody needs to take advantage of that, because if we all start in that place, we're going to really, really dramatically improve the opportunities we have to provide services to people in Ohio. And to me, that's pretty exciting, and I've seen a whole lot of change just within the last couple of years, and I certainly expect more as we continue to move and grow in this direction. There is a link related to trauma-informed care. In fact, we can make the link a resource in this video where you can go, where there's been multiple videos of people with lived experience, and that's a really neat term. I love the term lived experience. So these are people who have gone through trauma, they're talking about it, they're giving us the information that we need to make sure that when we become involved, that we do it in a way that uses that trauma-informed lens, that uses our skills and abilities to help move people in a positive direction rather than re-traumatizing. And so we'll provide those links at the end of the video.